The history of the United States of America is a journey through time that begins long before the arrival of European explorers and settlers. To understand the foundation of the nation, it is essential to delve into the rich tapestry of cultures, civilizations, and landscapes that define pre-colonial North America. For thousands of years, the continent was home to indigenous peoples whose complex societies, traditions, and systems of governance thrived across diverse regions. From the bustling trade networks of the Mississippi River Valley to the resourceful communities of the Great Plains and the intricate societies of the Pacific Northwest, these peoples had a profound connection to the land, shaping its ecology and culture in ways that are still visible today. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, North America was a vibrant mosaic of cultures. The Mississippian culture, for example, was renowned for its monumental earthworks and urban centers like Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis. Cahokia, a sprawling city that peaked around the 12th century, featured enormous mounds built for ceremonial and administrative purposes, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of engineering and social organization. Similarly, the Iroquois Confederacy, an alliance of 5, and later 6, nations in the northeastern woodlands, demonstrated advanced political systems that emphasized diplomacy, consensus building, and collective governance. These societies were not isolated. They engaged in trade, shared innovations, and influenced one another, creating a rich interplay of ideas and practices. The arrival of Europeans in the late 15th and early 16th centuries marked a significant turning point. Driven by ambitions of exploration, wealth, and religious conversion, European powers like Spain, France, and England set their sights on the New World. Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage under the Spanish flag is often regarded as the symbolic beginning of European presence in the Americas. However, it is essential to recognize that his journey was one of many exploratory efforts. Spanish conquistadors soon followed, establishing colonies in the Caribbean and extending their reach into present-day Mexico, Florida, and the American Southwest. These expeditions, while often celebrated in European histories, brought devastating consequences for indigenous populations, including violence, enslavement, and the spread of diseases like smallpox, which decimated entire communities. As Spain expanded its influence, other European nations sought their share of the New World's riches. France established settlements in Canada and along the Mississippi River, cultivating lucrative fur trade relationships with indigenous groups. England, after a delayed start, made its mark with the establishment of Jamestown in 1607, the first permanent English colony in what would become the United States. The English settlers faced immense challenges, from harsh winters and food shortages to conflicts with local tribes like the Powhatan Confederacy. Despite these struggles, Jamestown survived and became a blueprint for future English colonization efforts. The colonization of North America was not solely an act of conquest. It was also a cultural exchange, albeit one characterized by stark inequalities and profound disruptions. European settlers brought with them plants, animals, technologies, and ideas that transformed the landscape and societies of the Americas. Crops like wheat, barley, and apples were introduced, alongside domesticated animals such as cattle, pigs, and horses. Conversely, indigenous agricultural practices and crops, maize, potatoes, and tobacco, made their way to Europe, profoundly influencing global diets and economies. Yet, these exchanges were not without conflict. The introduction of European livestock often led to the destruction of indigenous agricultural lands, while competition over resources fueled tensions and violence. Religion played a significant role in the colonization process. Missionary efforts, particularly by Spanish and French Catholics, sought to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. These missions were often accompanied by efforts to reshape indigenous cultures, replacing traditional practices with European customs. While some indigenous groups adopted aspects of Christianity, others resisted, seeking to preserve their spiritual and cultural identities. These interactions reveal the complexities of cultural encounters in early America, where adaptation, resistance, and assimilation coexisted. By the early 17th century, European settlements had begun to establish a foothold along the eastern seaboard of North America. The English colonies, from Massachusetts Bay in the north to the Carolinas in the south, developed distinct regional identities shaped by their geographic and economic circumstances. New England, with its rocky soil and cooler climate, emphasized small-scale farming, fishing, and trade, while the southern colonies relied on large plantations and enslaved labor to produce cash crops like tobacco and rice. The middle colonies, such as Pennsylvania and New York, became melting pots of cultures and religions, attracting settlers from across Europe. This diversity laid the groundwork for the pluralistic society that would later define the United States. However, the growth of European colonies came at a tremendous cost to indigenous peoples. As settlers expanded westward, they encroached on native lands, leading to displacement, conflict, and loss of life. Treaties were often made under duress or deceit, stripping indigenous groups of their territories and resources. Wars, such as King Philip's War in New England and the Powhatan Wars in Virginia, underscored the violent clashes between colonists and native communities. These conflicts were not only about land, but also about competing visions of how to live and relate to the natural world. The early colonial period was also marked by the emergence of transatlantic trade networks that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This triangular trade system brought goods, people, and ideas across the Atlantic, transforming societies on all sides. Enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas to labor on plantations, creating wealth for European and colonial elites while enduring unimaginable suffering. This system of slavery would become a defining feature of American history, shaping its economy, culture, and political struggles for centuries to come. Despite the hardships and injustices of this era, the foundations of a new society were beginning to take shape. The colonies developed systems of self-governance, such as town meetings in New England and representative assemblies, like the Virginia House of Burgesses. These institutions reflected the colonists' desire for autonomy and set the stage for later demands for independence from British rule. At the same time, the colonies became increasingly interconnected, creating a shared sense of identity and purpose. The early history of the United States is a story of contrasts. Thriving indigenous civilizations disrupted by European expansion, cultural exchanges marked by both enrichment and exploitation, and the establishment of colonies that would one day unite to challenge the might of an empire. These beginnings reveal the complexity of America's origins, a blend of hope and hardship, resilience and resistance. As we explore the chapters that follow, it becomes clear that the history of the United States is not only about the events that shaped a nation, but also about the enduring legacies of those who lived, struggled, and dreamed in its earliest days. The establishment of the 13 British colonies in North America marked the beginning of a transformative era, as these settlements laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the United States. The colonial experience was shaped by a variety of factors, including the motivations of settlers, the geography of the regions they inhabited, and the interactions they had with indigenous peoples and each other. From the dense forests of New England to the fertile farmlands of the Chesapeake and the warm climates of the southern colonies, each region developed unique characteristics, yet all shared common challenges in adapting to a new and often unforgiving environment. The earliest English colonies, such as Jamestown in Virginia, were motivated by a blend of economic aspirations and a desire for expansion. Established in 1607, Jamestown was backed by the Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise seeking to profit from the New World. The settlers faced numerous challenges, including harsh winters, disease, and conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy. Initially, their efforts to establish a stable settlement faltered, but the introduction of tobacco as a cash crop by John Rolfe transformed Jamestown's fortunes. Tobacco cultivation demanded vast tracts of land and intensive labor, setting the stage for the colony's reliance on indentured servants and, eventually, enslaved Africans. This reliance on labor-intensive agriculture would become a defining feature of the southern colonies. In contrast to Virginia, the New England colonies were driven more by religious motivations than by economic gain. Settlers in this region, including the Pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower in 1620 and the Puritans who followed in the 1630s, sought to establish communities based on their interpretations of Christianity. The harsh climate and rocky soil of New England made large-scale agriculture impractical, so the economy instead revolved around small-scale farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The Puritans, in particular, emphasized a sense of communal responsibility and moral discipline, shaping the social and political structures of their settlements. Town meetings, which allowed male church members to participate in decision-making, became a hallmark of New England governance, reflecting an early form of democratic practice. While New England was characterized by tight-knit, religiously motivated communities, the middle colonies, such as Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, were notable for their diversity. These colonies attracted settlers from a wide array of backgrounds, including English, Dutch, German, and Scandinavian immigrants, as well as religious minorities like Quakers, Catholics, and Jews. This diversity fostered a more tolerant and pluralistic society, where different cultural and religious practices could coexist. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn as a haven for Quakers, exemplified these values, promoting religious freedom and equitable relations with indigenous peoples, at least in its early years. The fertile soil and favorable climate of the middle colonies supported a robust agricultural economy, producing grains and livestock that were exported to other regions. The southern colonies, which included Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia, were characterized by their plantation economies and hierarchical social structures. The warm climate and long growing seasons made these colonies ideal for cultivating labor-intensive crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. As a result, the southern colonies became increasingly dependent on enslaved African labor. The institution of slavery not only shaped the economy, but also had profound social and cultural impacts, creating a rigid class system that placed wealthy planters at the top and enslaved individuals at the bottom. This reliance on slavery would have lasting consequences, influencing the development of racial ideologies and sparking debates that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The interactions between European settlers and indigenous peoples were complex and often fraught with tension. Initially, many Native American groups engaged in trade with the settlers, exchanging furs, food, and knowledge for European goods such as metal tools, firearms, and textiles. However, these interactions were often unequal, with Europeans using their technological advantages to exploit indigenous communities. As settlements expanded, conflicts over land became increasingly common. In New England, King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, was a particularly devastating conflict between Native American tribes and English settlers, resulting in significant loss of life and the displacement of many indigenous communities. Similar patterns of conflict and displacement occurred in other regions, as colonial expansion encroached on native lands and disrupted traditional ways of life. The colonial economy was deeply intertwined with the broader Atlantic world, particularly through the system of transatlantic trade. This system connected the colonies with Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean in a triangular network of goods, people, and resources. Raw materials such as tobacco, sugar, and cotton were exported from the Americas to Europe, where they were processed into finished goods. These goods were then traded in Africa for enslaved individuals, who were transported to the Americas to labor on plantations. This system of trade not only fueled the colonial economy, but also entrenched the institution of slavery, with profound moral and social implications. Colonial society was marked by significant inequalities, both within the colonies and between the colonies and the British Crown. Within the colonies, social hierarchies were shaped by factors such as wealth, race, and gender. Wealthy landowners and merchants occupied the top of the social ladder, while indentured servants, enslaved individuals, and poor laborers made up the lower strata. Women, regardless of class, faced legal and social restrictions that limited their rights and opportunities, though they played crucial roles in maintaining households and contributing to the economy. The relationship between the colonies and the British Crown was also a source of tension. While the colonies enjoyed a degree of autonomy through local assemblies and self-governance, they were ultimately subject to British authority. The Crown imposed regulations on trade and taxation to ensure that the colonies contributed to the economic interests of the empire. The Navigation Acts, for example, required that colonial goods be transported on British ships and traded exclusively with Britain. While these policies were intended to benefit the empire as a whole, they often provoked resentment among colonists, who felt that their economic interests were being subordinated to those of the mother country. Despite these challenges, the colonies were remarkably resilient and dynamic. Their populations grew rapidly, fueled by both natural increase and immigration. Cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston became bustling centers of commerce and culture, while the rural hinterlands expanded as settlers pushed westward. The colonies developed a distinctive identity, shaped by their shared experiences of adaptation, conflict, and innovation. This identity was not monolithic, but rather a tapestry of regional, cultural, and religious influences that reflected the diversity of the colonial experience. The seeds of revolution were already being sown during this period, as colonists began to question their relationship with Britain and assert their own aspirations for self-determination. While the colonies were still loyal to the Crown, the principles of self-governance and individual rights were deeply ingrained in their political culture. These principles, coupled with the economic and social tensions that characterized colonial life, would eventually lead to a movement for independence. The story of the 13 colonies is one of perseverance and transformation. From their humble beginnings as small, struggling settlements, they grew into thriving communities that laid the foundation for a new nation. The challenges they faced, adapting to new environments, navigating complex relationships with indigenous peoples, and balancing their aspirations with the realities of colonial rule, shaped their development and left a lasting legacy. As we move forward in the story of the United States, the lessons of the colonial era continue to resonate, reminding us of the resilience, diversity, and ambition that defined the earliest chapters of American history. The seeds of revolution in the American colonies were sown long before the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. The journey toward revolution was shaped by a complex interplay of political, economic, and social factors that gradually eroded the bonds between Britain and its colonies. Over time, what began as grievances over policies and governance transformed into a unified call for independence, as colonists grappled with the ideals of liberty, self-determination, and resistance to tyranny. The roots of colonial discontent can be traced to the aftermath of the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. This conflict, which pitted Britain and its colonial allies against France and its Native American partners, ended in a decisive British victory. However, the war left Britain deeply in debt, prompting the Crown to seek new revenue streams from its colonies. The Proclamation of 1763, issued in the wake of the war, was one of the first policies to ignite tensions. Designed to prevent conflicts with Native Americans, the proclamation prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. While intended as a measure to stabilize the frontier, it frustrated colonists eager to expand into new lands and fostered resentment toward British interference in their affairs. The economic strain of the war also led to the introduction of new taxes, which became a flashpoint for colonial resistance. The Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765 were among the first measures to spark widespread opposition. The Stamp Act, in particular, was a direct tax on printed materials, affecting everyone from merchants to lawyers and newspapers. Colonists saw these taxes as an infringement on their rights, as they were imposed without their consent. The rallying cry of "No taxation without representation" emerged as a unifying slogan, encapsulating the colonists' belief that only their elected assemblies had the right to levy taxes. The resistance to the Stamp Act took various forms, from petitions and boycotts to more direct actions, such as the harassment of tax collectors. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by figures like Samuel Adams, organized protests and built networks of communication that would prove crucial in the years to come. In response to colonial unrest, the British government repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting Parliament's authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This statement of power, while symbolic, underscored the growing divide between the colonies and the Crown. The introduction of the Townshend Acts in 1767 further exacerbated tensions. These acts imposed duties on imported goods such as glass, paper, and tea, fueling anger among merchants and consumers alike. The colonists' response included renewed boycotts and the formation of committees of correspondence, which facilitated communication and coordination among the colonies. The colonial economy became another battleground in the struggle for autonomy. British mercantilist policies, designed to benefit the mother country, restricted colonial trade and industry. The Navigation Acts, enforced more rigorously after the French and Indian War, required that goods be transported on British ships and that certain commodities, like tobacco and sugar, be exported exclusively to Britain. These regulations limited economic opportunities for colonial merchants and spurred resentment. Smuggling became widespread, and colonial leaders increasingly questioned the fairness of a system that seemed designed to enrich Britain at their expense. The 1770 Boston Massacre marked a turning point in colonial resistance. Tensions had been escalating in Boston, where British soldiers were stationed to enforce the Crown's policies. On March 5, 1770, a confrontation between soldiers and a crowd of colonists turned deadly when troops fired into the crowd, killing 5 men. Among the victims was Crispus Attucks, often considered the first casualty of the American Revolution. The incident was quickly seized upon by colonial leaders as evidence of British oppression. Propaganda, such as Paul Revere's famous engraving of the massacre, fueled outrage and helped to galvanize support for the colonial cause. The Tea Act of 1773 and the subsequent Boston Tea Party further escalated the conflict. The Tea Act was intended to rescue the struggling British East India Company by granting it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. While the act actually lowered the price of tea, colonists viewed it as another example of Britain imposing its will without colonial consent. In December 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped an entire shipment of tea into the water. This act of defiance prompted the British government to respond with a series of punitive measures known as the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts, enacted in 1774, were designed to punish Massachusetts and assert British authority. They included the closure of Boston Harbor, the dissolution of the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly, and the Quartering Act, which required colonists to house British soldiers. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, these measures united the colonies in opposition to Britain. The First Continental Congress convened in September 1774, bringing together representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies to coordinate their response. This gathering marked a significant step toward colonial unity, as leaders debated how best to address their grievances and assert their rights. As tensions continued to rise, colonial militias began to prepare for the possibility of armed conflict. These citizen soldiers, known as Minutemen, were ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. The situation reached a breaking point in April 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord. British troops, sent to confiscate colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders, were met by armed militias. The shot heard round the world, as poet Ralph Waldo Emerson later described it, marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War. The battles demonstrated the colonists' willingness to fight for their rights and their growing confidence in their ability to challenge British authority. The intellectual underpinnings of the Revolution were as important as its political and economic causes. Enlightenment ideas about liberty, natural rights, and the social contract influenced colonial leaders and provided a framework for their arguments against British rule. Thinkers like John Locke asserted that governments derived their authority from the consent of the governed, and that people had a right to rebel against unjust rulers. These ideas resonated with colonists, who saw British policies as a violation of their rights as English subjects. The Revolution was not just a political movement, but also a social and cultural awakening. It brought together people from diverse backgrounds and regions, forging a shared identity as Americans. Women, though excluded from formal political participation, played crucial roles in the resistance, from organizing boycotts to producing homespun goods. Enslaved individuals and free black people also grappled with the promises and contradictions of the Revolution, as calls for liberty and equality clashed with the realities of slavery and racial discrimination. By the time the Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, the colonies were on the brink of full-scale war. While some delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, the majority recognized that the relationship was irreparably broken. The publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January 1776 further solidified support for independence. Paine's pamphlet, written in plain, persuasive language, argued that it was not only necessary, but also natural for the colonies to break free from British rule. The seeds of revolution, carefully nurtured over years of struggle and debate, had taken root. The colonists' resistance to British policies evolved into a broader movement for independence, driven by the belief that liberty and self-governance were worth fighting for. As the colonies prepared to declare their independence, they carried with them the lessons and experiences of a long and arduous journey toward freedom. These formative years, filled with conflict, compromise, and courage, set the stage for the birth of a new nation. The American Revolution was not merely a sudden rebellion, but the culmination of years of growing tensions, ideological shifts, and increasing defiance against British authority. The initial stages of the Revolution were marked by uncertainty, as the colonies grappled with their own limitations while facing the might of the British Empire. From the opening conflicts at Lexington and Concord to the formal declaration of war, this period laid the foundation for the long struggle that would eventually lead to independence. The battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775 marked the first open military engagements between colonial militias and British forces. What began as an attempt by British troops to confiscate weapons and arrest rebel leaders quickly escalated into a full-scale skirmish. The colonists, warned by writers like Paul Revere, were prepared to resist, and their ability to stand their ground surprised many, including the British. These confrontations proved that the colonists were willing to take up arms to defend their rights. signaling the start of an armed conflict that neither side had fully anticipated. Following these initial clashes, the Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775 to determine the colony's next steps. This body of representatives faced significant challenges, as the colonies were not yet united in their aims or strategies. Some delegates, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, still sought reconciliation with Britain, while others, such as John Adams of Massachusetts, pushed for more decisive action. Despite their differences, the Congress agreed on the need to prepare for war, authorizing the creation of the Continental Army and appointing George Washington as its commander. Washington's leadership was seen as crucial, not only because of his military experience, but also because his appointment helped unify the northern and southern colonies. While the Continental Congress debated, fighting continued to spread. The Battle of Bunker Hill, fought in June 1775, was a significant early conflict that demonstrated both the determination of the colonial forces and the challenges they faced. Although the British ultimately claimed victory, they suffered heavy casualties, highlighting the resilience of the American militias. The battle also underscored the colony's need for greater organization, supplies, and support if they were to sustain a prolonged conflict. Even as military engagements intensified, there were efforts to seek a peaceful resolution. In July 1775, the Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, expressing loyalty to the Crown while requesting an end to hostilities and the repeal of oppressive policies. However, the king rejected the petition and declared the colonies to be an open rebellion. This response effectively ended hopes for reconciliation and strengthened the resolve of those advocating for independence. The ideological foundation for the revolution was also taking shape during this period. Enlightenment ideas, which emphasized reason, individual rights, and the social contract, deeply influenced colonial leaders. Writers like John Locke and Montesquieu provided the intellectual framework for arguments against British rule. These ideas were disseminated through pamphlets, speeches, and newspapers, reaching a broad audience and fostering a sense of shared purpose among the colonists. One of the most influential works of this period was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776. Paine's pamphlet presented a compelling case for independence, arguing that it was both a practical necessity and a moral imperative for the colonies to break free from Britain. Written in plain, accessible language, Common Sense resonated with ordinary colonists, galvanizing support for the revolutionary cause. Paine's work not only critiqued British governance, but also envisioned a new, democratic society based on equality and self-determination. As support for independence grew, the Continental Congress took steps to formalize the colony's break from Britain. On July 2, 1776, the Congress voted in favor of independence, and 2 days later, the Declaration of Independence, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, was adopted. The document articulated the colony's grievances against the British Crown and asserted their right to self-governance. It also enshrined the revolutionary principles of liberty and equality, though these ideals would remain aspirational for many groups within the colonies. The Declaration of Independence marked a turning point, but it also signaled the beginning of a daunting struggle. The colonies faced numerous challenges in their fight against Britain, including a lack of resources, an untrained military, and internal divisions. The British, by contrast, commanded the world's most powerful military, with a well-equipped army, a formidable navy, and extensive financial resources. They also benefited from the support of loyalists within the colonies, colonists who remained loyal to the crown and opposed the revolutionary movement. Despite these disadvantages, the colonists demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. Under Washington's leadership, the Continental Army adopted unconventional tactics, often relying on guerrilla warfare and strategic retreats to offset British superiority. The colonists also received critical support from foreign allies, most notably France. After the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, France formally entered the war as an ally of the United States, providing much-needed military aid, supplies, and naval support. The involvement of other nations, including Spain and the Netherlands, further shifted the balance of power, transforming the conflict into a global war. The revolution was not fought solely on battlefields. It also involved profound social and cultural changes. The war disrupted traditional hierarchies and created opportunities for marginalized groups to assert their rights and roles in society. Women, for example, played vital roles in the revolutionary effort, from managing farms and businesses in the absence of men to serving as spies, nurses, and even soldiers in some cases. Figures like Abigail Adams advocated for greater rights for women, famously urging her husband, John Adams, to remember the ladies when drafting the new nation's laws. The revolution also raised questions about slavery and the status of Black Americans. While the rhetoric of liberty and equality inspired some enslaved individuals to seek their freedom, the institution of slavery remained deeply entrenched, particularly in the southern colonies. Some enslaved people gained their freedom by fighting for the British, who offered emancipation to those who joined their ranks. Others fought for the American cause, hoping that the new nation would honor its revolutionary ideals by abolishing slavery. These contradictions between the promise of the revolution and its realities would persist, shaping the nation's future struggles for civil rights. The war also had profound effects on Native American communities. Many tribes were drawn into the conflict, often aligning with the British in the hope of protecting their lands from colonial expansion. However, the outcome of the war led to further displacement and loss of territory for Native peoples as the new United States expanded westward. By 1781, the tide of the war had turned in favor of the Americans. The decisive victory at the Battle of Yorktown, where British General Cornwallis surrendered to Washington's forces, effectively ended major combat operations. Although the Treaty of Paris, which formally ended the war, was not signed until 1783, the colonies had secured their independence. The United States emerged as a new nation, free to chart its own course but facing significant challenges in building a stable government and society. The early stages of the revolution reveal the complexities and contradictions of the struggle for independence. It was a war fought not just against British rule, but also for a vision of a new kind of society, one grounded in principles of liberty and equality. However, these principles were not fully realized in the revolution's immediate aftermath, as the new nation grappled with the legacies of slavery, inequality, and exclusion. The American Revolution was thus not just the birth of a nation, but the beginning of an ongoing process of defining and expanding the meaning of freedom and democracy. The story of the American Revolution did not end with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Rather, the end of the war marked the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter in the history of the United States. The challenges of uniting 13 disparate colonies into a single nation were immense. The ideals of liberty, equality, and self-governance that had inspired the revolution now had to be translated into a functional system of government. The fledgling nation faced the daunting task of creating political institutions, addressing economic instability, and reconciling regional and ideological divisions, while remaining true to the principles that had fueled its fight for independence. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the United States operated under the Articles of Confederation, a system that reflected the colonists' deep-seated fear of centralized authority. The Articles granted significant power to the individual states while limiting the authority of the federal government. This decentralized approach, while appealing in theory, soon revealed its shortcomings. The federal government lacked the power to levy taxes, regulate commerce, or enforce laws effectively. As a result, it struggled to address critical issues, including war debts, economic recovery, and territorial disputes. Economic instability was one of the most pressing challenges. The war had left the United States deeply in debt, with both the federal government and individual states owing substantial sums to domestic and foreign creditors. The inability of the federal government to impose taxes under the Articles of Confederation made it nearly impossible to pay off these debts or fund essential services. Inflation and economic depression further compounded the problem, leading to widespread discontent among farmers, laborers, and small business owners. Shays' Rebellion, an armed uprising in Massachusetts in 1786 to 1787, exemplified the growing frustration with economic hardships and the perceived failures of government. The rebellion underscored the need for a stronger federal government capable of addressing such crises. At the same time, the new nation faced significant challenges in managing its western territories. The Treaty of Paris had granted the United States vast tracts of land stretching to the Mississippi River, but this expansion brought new conflicts. Native American tribes in these territories resisted the encroachment of settlers, leading to a series of violent confrontations. Additionally, disputes among the states over claims to western lands threatened to undermine national unity. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, one of the few achievements of the Confederation Congress, established a framework for the orderly settlement and governance of these territories, banning slavery in the Northwest Territory and setting a precedent for future westward expansion. The limitations of the Articles of Confederation became increasingly evident, prompting calls for reform. In 1787, delegates from 12 states convened in Philadelphia for what became known as the Constitutional Convention. Initially tasked with revising the Articles, the delegates instead chose to draft an entirely new constitution. The resulting document sought to balance the need for a stronger federal government with the preservation of individual liberties and state sovereignty. It established a system of checks and balances among three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, and included mechanisms for amending the Constitution to address future challenges. The Constitution, however, was not without its critics. The ratification process sparked intense debates between Federalists, who supported the new framework, and Anti-Federalists, who feared it would concentrate too much power in the hands of a central authority. The Anti-Federalists were particularly concerned about the lack of explicit protections for individual rights. In response, the Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, ensuring its ratification. The first 10 amendments, ratified in 1791, enshrined fundamental liberties such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press, as well as protections against arbitrary government actions. With the Constitution in place, the United States embarked on the challenging task of building a functioning government. George Washington, unanimously elected as the nation's first president in 1789, set important precedents for the executive branch. His administration established the first cabinet, implemented policies to stabilize the economy, and navigated foreign relations in a turbulent international landscape. Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, played a pivotal role in shaping the nation's financial system, advocating for the assumption of state debts by the federal government, the creation of a national bank, and the promotion of manufacturing. Despite these efforts, deep divisions persisted within the young republic. The question of how to interpret the Constitution and the role of the federal government became a source of contention, leading to the emergence of political factions. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, favored a strong central government and a broad interpretation of constitutional powers, while the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, advocated for states' rights and a more limited federal role. These divisions would shape the nation's political landscape for decades to come. Culturally, the post-revolutionary period was a time of significant transformation. The ideals of the revolution inspired a reevaluation of social norms and institutions. In the North, gradual emancipation laws began to challenge the institution of slavery, though progress was slow and uneven. In the South, slavery became even more entrenched, as the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 revitalized the demand for enslaved labor. These regional differences set the stage for future conflicts over the issue of slavery, which would ultimately culminate in the Civil War. Women also sought to assert their roles in the new republic. While the revolution had opened some opportunities for women to participate in public life, such as organizing boycotts and supporting the war effort, their legal and political status remained largely unchanged. The concept of Republican motherhood emerged during this period, emphasizing the role of women in educating and nurturing virtuous citizens. While this idea reinforced traditional gender roles, it also acknowledged women's influence in shaping the moral and intellectual foundations of the nation. For Native Americans, the end of the Revolution marked the beginning of a new phase of displacement and resistance. Despite the promises of diplomacy and treaties, the expansion of American settlements into indigenous lands led to continued conflict. Native nations in the Ohio Valley and beyond fought to defend their territories, culminating in significant confrontations such as the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. The resulting Treaty of Greenville forced many tribes to cede large portions of their land, further marginalizing Native communities. The United States also had to navigate its place in a world dominated by powerful European empires. The French Revolution and subsequent wars in Europe posed significant challenges for American foreign policy. While some Americans, particularly Democratic Republicans, sympathized with revolutionary France, others, including Federalists, favored maintaining neutrality to avoid entanglement in European conflicts. Washington's farewell address in 1796 encapsulated this sentiment, warning against foreign alliances and emphasizing the importance of national unity. As the 18th century drew to a close, the United States faced both opportunities and challenges. The principles of liberty and equality that had inspired the Revolution continued to shape the nation's identity, but their application was far from universal. The contradictions between these ideals and the realities of slavery, inequality, and exclusion were stark, highlighting the ongoing struggle to define and achieve the promise of the Revolution. The legacy of the Revolution was profound and far-reaching. It established a precedent for democratic governance and inspired movements for liberty and independence around the world. At the same time, it underscored the complexities of building a nation that could reconcile diverse interests, identities, and aspirations. The early years of the Republic were a time of experimentation, adaptation, and growth as the United States sought to live up to its revolutionary ideals while confronting the practical challenges of nationhood. The birth of the United States was not the end of the revolutionary journey, but rather its beginning. The questions raised during this period, about the meaning of liberty, the limits of government, and the rights of individuals, remain central to the American experience. The struggle to fulfill the promise of the Revolution continued, shaping the nation's history and its ongoing quest to create a more perfect union.